Hello and welcome. This is video number 3 in a 4-part series about what I call pre-World War II aggressors. In the series, we're looking at the moves made by Japan, Italy, and Germany in the years leading up to World War II. In today's video, the focus is going to be on some of the early ways that Germany began to defy the Treaty of Versailles in the first half of the 1930s on their way towards becoming a true aggressor nation. So here we go. All right, Germany, after World War I, was in pretty rough shape. And we talked the other day about the rise of Hitler to power in Germany. And getting into the 1930s, where we'll pick up with that, Hitler and the Nazis were at a point with Germany where they had control of the country and could basically go whatever direction they wanted to with it. Now, despite that, technically, the Treaty of Versailles was still in play, and restrictions that had been placed on Germany based on the treaty still existed. And if anyone wanted to try to enforce them, if Germany tried to violate them, was certainly able to do so. So now we pick up in 1935. One of the things that the Treaty of Versailles forbid Germany from doing was rebuilding its military. Basically, according to the treaty, Germany was not allowed to have more than 100,000 soldiers. They weren't allowed to have submarines. They weren't allowed to have an air force. What they could have with their navy was very small and very limited. Despite that, Hitler decided to start rebuilding the military. This was not done secretly. People in the world knew that this was starting to happen, but the League of Nations and any other country that knew about this and didn't like it and maybe could have said something about it simply didn't. It's not that people necessarily liked it, but it didn't seem like the kind of thing anybody wanted to mess with, at least at the time, if nothing else, to avoid getting into a conflict. And so Hitler and Germany simply started rebuilding their military. Now, part of why this should have been concerning to people who knew about this is if you would have read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, you would have known one of the things that was a goal of his was Lebensraum, or living space. And so what's one way that you could gain more territory for the people of your country? Well, through military conquest. So it should have not been too difficult at that point in time to think there could be a connection between rebuilding the military and a desire for more land. However anybody looked at it, however everybody thought about it, nobody was willing to step up and do anything, at least not at this point. One of the first territories that Hitler had an interest in and would pursue acquiring was an area called the Rhineland. The Rhineland was supposed to be a demilitarized zone, kind of creating a little bit of a buffer between Germany and in particular France. One of the reasons why Germany had an interest in this territory was that it was an industrial zone. It was a significant area for coal and steel and iron production. And one of the things that Germany really needed if it was going to continue to be rebuilding was to have access to those kinds of raw materials and resources. Now, when Germany went into the Rhineland in 1936, they didn't really have much of a military yet, and they didn't use force either as they went in and occupied the Rhineland. In a way, it's kind of like they just sort of walked in and took possession of it. Nobody really did anything about it. I think there was a lot of rationalizing going on that this was territory that should have belonged to Germany anyway. What was the harm? Basically, whatever anybody could come up with to avoid feeling compelled to do something about it. This is a good example of the appeasement that was going on at this time. Appeasement, by definition, is giving in to an aggressor to maintain peace. It's not necessarily wrong to give in to somebody to try to promote the peace. The trick is to know when you need to step up and say no to something and when you need to let something slide. At any rate, at this point, Germany was able to almost literally just walk into the Rhineland and acquire this territory. Now, one thing that Hitler would later say that makes allowing this such a bad decision on the part of those that could have done something about it is he said if anybody would have stepped up and said, hold it, you're not going to get to do this, we're not going to let you do this, Hitler and Germany would have backed down at that point, because the reality was they didn't have their military rebuilt enough to actually get in a fight with somebody and hope to succeed. So the fact that they were simply allowed to do this only emboldened Hitler and Germany to continue rebuilding and continue to pursue the things that they wanted to have, whether they were supposed to pursue those things or not. And so, like I was just kind of speaking to here, Hitler just simply became more and more aggressive. And it's also important to point out that this kind of action or lack of action, I guess you could say, had an impact on other aggressors at the time too. We've already talked a little bit about Japan and Italy and some of the things they were working on. As aggressors saw that nobody seemed to be willing to step in, it simply motivated all of them, whether you're talking specifically about Hitler in Germany right now or anybody else with aggressive goals. Now, as this rebuilding process was happening, it's important to speak just a little bit to some of the alliances that were starting to form at this time, and also how different countries around the world were reacting to that, or maybe not reacting to that. One thing to speak to at this point, because this corresponds pretty close to the time the Rhineland was acquired, is we see the development of a new alliance of countries called the Axis powers. Italy and Germany made an agreement with each other to support one another. By October of 1936, Japan became a part of that agreement the next month in November. And so by the end of 1936, these three aggressor countries had formally aligned with each other, not necessarily because they agreed with each other on a lot of things, but as much as anything, just kind of an understanding that they had some common goals that they were interested in, namely going after more territory for their own people, and that they certainly wouldn't interfere with each other as long as the others didn't interfere with them. And so I think their hope in these early stages was that ultimately the three of them would come to control the different parts of the world that they were seeking to control. Now, the United States definitely was aware of things that were going on in Europe and in Asia with Japan. But our position at this time was one of isolation. Even though we got involved with World War I, that was really out of character for our country. And as soon as the war was done, we went back to what was more our norm at that time, which was to really just keep to ourselves. We didn't want to get into any kind of specific connections with other countries beyond just the trade arrangements that we set up with them. We were happy to do business with other people, but we didn't necessarily want to make very clear allies that we would then be obligated to support. And in fact, our Congress went so far during the 1930s to pass a series of neutrality acts to try to make it very clear that our official position as a country, as it pertained to other countries around the world, was one of a neutral country. Now, we certainly had opinions, things that we thought were better, things that we thought were worse, but our official stance was one of neutrality, at least at this point. Well, hopefully that was helpful in talking a little bit about ways in which Germany was defying the Treaty of Versailles and beginning to think more aggressively. If you'll watch in the next video, I will talk more about the actual aggressive moves that Germany made that enabled to get them more and more territory in the events leading up to the actual start of World War II. Thanks for watching.